With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us here in the Situation Room on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. So thank you so much for joining us, whether you're joining us via Mixer, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, Periscope, Facebook Live, however you're watching. Maybe you're watching on the terrestrial signal. Although if that's the case, you're really more listening than watching. You're just hearing my voice. Anyway, we are certainly glad to have you on the program today. There is a lot to talk about, as there always is. That's just kind of how the news runs, especially with our 24-hour news cycle. But today is our 200th episode, so that's pretty awesome. We've been running for 200 episodes, which is exactly 195 episodes longer than I thought it would last, so here we are. No, I really didn't know if this was going to go more than a week, and we thought about, maybe just transitioning it back to the terrestrial show, and there were a lot of different options that we had talked about. I didn't know if it was actually going to stay as a podcast for this long, and thankfully it has. Thankfully we've been able to do this and bring you content directly to you, including video. Now I know that the addition of seeing me every day instead of just hearing my voice is probably a tremendous letdown, and I understand that because my voice is far better than my face. And if I could just... Actually, I want to, at some point, just be a disembodied voice. That would be the preferred way to live, in my opinion. But nonetheless, here we are 200 episodes later, and I do really appreciate the audience staying with me. I appreciate the audience feedback. I appreciate your support. Really just this past week, and I think it is partially because of all the election coverage. I've had no telling how many dozens of people walk up to me and talk about how much they've enjoyed some of my programming, and I genuinely appreciate that. You don't know how much it means to me to know that there's somebody on the other side of the camera that is watching this and enjoying it, so I appreciate that. And there's something else that I do want to extend my appreciation to you, the listener, because I believe that we had a pretty serious impact on this. Now, I'm not saying that it changed the outcome of the election, because that would be quite a stretch, especially considering the overwhelming numbers that came out with this. But with this election, Amendment 1 not only failed, it failed miserably in spectacular fashion. 75% of people agree that Amendment 1 was a bad idea. You can't get 75% of any group of people to agree on anything, much less 75% of Alabamians to agree on this. But apparently, when you had the people of Alabama look at this bill and look at that, A, it would take away our ability to elect our school board members, and B, and I think that this was even more important. In fact, I think that this was the most important part of the bill, that it basically enshrined Common Core indefinitely as a part of Alabama's Constitution. We took a look at that. I was like, no thanks, check please. Didn't have to think real hard about it. I actually thought that it would wind up failing. I was cautious and a little scared about it, to be honest, because no matter how bad the amendment is, usually somehow, if it's a ballot measure, it winds up passing no matter how bad the amendment is in Alabama, and that's unfortunate. But I got the feeling, based on the number of people that I had talked to that were against it, that this thing probably winds up failing, but I was thinking it would be like at the absolute most. My greatest wish was that it failed by 55% and they get the idea, okay, the people of Alabama pretty convincingly don't want this. Maybe we'll try again in a few years. 75%, man, that was spectacular. And if you watched my live coverage of the event, we had a 2-hour live stream giving all of the live reaction and live coverage of the election results, and it featured WSFA, our news partners over there, their numbers, their broadcasts. So really great program that we were able to put on. And by the way, it was, I think, our third most viewed program of the year. So thank you for tuning into that as well. But I didn't talk a whole lot about it, simply because, A, it failed, so there wasn't a whole lot of fallout, because if it failed, then that means nothing changes. So you don't really talk about the implications of it much, but that's one of the primary implications here, is that because it was such an overwhelming failure, well, the thing is, they're probably not going to try something similar to that again, at least not anytime soon. Oh, in 2 or 3 years, we may get a modified version of it, or they might even try to break up the two big measures that I just explained. One saying that we appoint our board members as opposed to elect them, and the second, and like I said, the one that was far less palatable than the other, is that it enshrines Common Core as our standard for the state of Alabama in perpetuity. So maybe they wind up breaking those up and trying again, but I just don't see that happening. It was such an overwhelming failure that I think that they leave this one alone, at least for a while, and try to come back a little bit later. It's sort of like the, I don't think that this is going to become like the lottery, to where it just comes up every so often, like every few years we have the lottery question or the gambling question again in Alabama. I don't think it becomes an issue like that, but it could be. I see that as being an unlikely scenario, though. So thank you to the listening audience. Thank you to the people of Alabama for making the right decision on this and making your voices extremely loud and clear. We do not want Common Core in the state of Alabama. And especially with the way that our education system is, and the way that our kids have been, unfortunately, not getting the education that they need, the education that they should have from Alabama's education system, continuing more of the same. We've had Common Core for 4 years now in Alabama, continuing along the same road and saying indefinitely we will follow the standard seemed to be a very foolish idea, and I'm glad that the people of Alabama saw that. So one other thing that I did want to talk about before we move on, it's Thursday, and typically in the legislative session that means that Becky Garrettson of Eagle Forum, Alabama, joins us to discuss what is going on in the Congress here in Alabama, but she is not doing that today because there are arguments that are going on right now, and she's actually away. She's listening to them, and she also had to do some traveling today, so she had a very busy schedule, wasn't able to be as generous with her time as she normally is, just because she had less of it to be generous with, and we certainly understand that. So what we're going to do is, we're going to go ahead and record something tomorrow and then bring it to you probably Monday. And I'm not sure exactly what form that'll take, but if you do want to hear my conversation with her, what I may wind up doing is airing that on News Radio 1440 during the Best Of program. And just so it's not like out of date by the time you hear it, we may just go ahead and do that and let that be the first hour of the Saturday morning show. So if you want to hear that, you could do it there, or you could wait till probably Monday and get an update on it then. But regardless, we'll get it to you. We'll distribute it in some way. We will let you know, especially if you're a subscriber to YouTube. By the way, if you're watching on YouTube right now, feel free to go down, subscribe, and click the little notification bell so that you actually do get notifications when we go live. So you can get all of those updates, and when we do bring out that interview in whatever form we do, whether it's a stream or whether we just put it out there as an individual video for you to watch, either way, you will get that content. We will make it available to you. We just were not able to do it today. So that being said, there's a lot to talk about in the aftermath of this election, and I want to get to that right now. I think it's appropriate that what we do here is we talk about some of the runoffs and how those are going to play out, because runoffs, of course, are different than general primaries where you may have 3, 4, 5, 6 candidates and one that they narrow it down to 2. And that's the point. If they weren't different, then there would be no reason to do them. So narrowing it down to 2 candidates does make a substantial difference, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that means in the 2 big runoffs that we have. The vast majority of the Alabama races kind of went pretty decisively. The one big exception, and it is a big one because it's a statewide race, The one big exception to that would be the Senate race, and on a local level, the big exception to that was the race for Alabama's 2nd District. If I'm not mistaken, every single other race did not result in a runoff. I think the only House seat that actually did result in a runoff is District 2, so we'll discuss both of those. First of all, we're going to start with the bigger one first. Jeff Sessions versus Tommy Tuberville. Those two did wind up finishing just about neck and neck. I mean, Tommy Tuberville did wind up taking the top spot, but it was by like a percentage point. So these guys are basically in a dead heat right now. That was the result of the last the election on Tuesday night, as we reported it to you here on the channel. So to give you a better understanding of this race, because I probably didn't give it its due diligence on this because we didn't have a choice of only 2 candidates. I had to cover all of the candidates, and we talked about all of them, their merits, their drawbacks, or their flaws. And so now I want to zero in a little bit more on these 2 candidates because I feel like I really haven't fleshed it out quite enough yet. So the swamp in the Department of Crony Capitalism, also known as the United States Chamber of Commerce, they despise Sessions. And always have. And part of the reason they do is because the Chamber of Crony Capitalism has always been a fan of hiring illegal cheap labor. In other words, illegal aliens. And because of that, they don't want a wall. They don't want to stop illegal immigration. They want that option available. And their donors want that option available. And that's why for the longest time, despite being a establishment that is friendly to the GOP, and even that is somewhat debatable, but it's long been at least viewed by outsiders as a branch of, or a group that is friendly to Republican causes because they're pro-business, but their version of pro-business is being in favor of crony capitalism, hence the nickname that I've given them, and because of that, they want special sweetheart deals and exceptions for the businesses that they like. And when it comes to illegal immigration, they really like the system where they can hire for pennies on the dollar illegal immigrants to come to this country and work and take jobs that should be going to either legal immigrants or American citizens. And so because they really don't want that gravy train to stop, they have for a long time opposed any kind of tough on the border legislation, and Jeff Sessions for a long period of time in his career, long before Trump even thought about running for president, has always been a border hawk. I mean, the guy, it was well known in the Senate. It was well known in the Senate and in the House, but especially in the Senate, that if you wanted to talk to somebody that was knowledgeable about the border and had been a warrior when it came to making sure the border is secure, who do you go see in the Senate? You go to see Jeff Sessions. Not even Ted Cruz, a guy that is from Texas, was seen as Jeff Sessions was the guy that if you wanted to go to talk about border security, he's the one you go to. Kind of like if you're in the Senate, you're like, all right, which senator should I talk to about the constitutionality of this bill? Oh, you go to Mike Lee. Yeah, Mike Lee, the guy's a constitutional scholar. Ted Cruz would also be a good option since he's argued in front of the Supreme Court, very knowledgeable about the Constitution. But you know what I'm saying? Like, in every group of people, there's the guy. And when it came to the border, Jeff Sessions was the guy. He's the guy that the other senators looked to when it came to border policy, at least the ones that were really serious about cracking down on illegal immigration. And that has been known for decades now. And that's the reason that the swamp in the Department of Crony Capitalism would hate to see Jeff Sessions back. Now, regardless of whether you like him or not, maybe you're even a Tommy Tuberville supporter, I'm just making the case that Jeff Sessions has always been excellent in that one particular area of policy making, and he's got a very conservative voting record in other areas. I'm not saying that's the only thing he's good at. But when it comes to that, Jeff Sessions is somebody that has a long-standing, proven track record of being tough on immigration. And I am suspicious. Now, we can't look at voting record because, of course, he doesn't have one. He's never held a office before. But I am somewhat suspicious that Tommy Tuberville, a guy whom I personally like, not only is he a former head coach of my alma mater, Auburn University, but he's also even somebody that goes to the same church as I do. I have deep respect for the man. I think he's a really good guy. But I'm concerned that he is not the border hawk that he claims to be. And there's a couple of reasons that I'm saying that. And I know I'm distilling this to one issue. I'm not saying this is the only one that counts. I'm saying right now I want to focus on this. So Rob Jessimer. Rob Jessimer is a guy that was hired by the Tuberville campaign as one of his top consultants. So this is a guy that is kind of in Tuberville's inner circle. He's one of the political consultants that he goes to for things including border policy. And this is not something that's secret. It's not like these are things that are going on in smoke-filled rooms behind closed doors and Caleb just heard about it because he's a political insider. No, this is something that's public record. Like, I think it's been a while ago now, but I want to say it was back in like last May that the Tuberville campaign actually announced this and sent it out in a press release. So this isn't something that they're hiding. You don't have to be somebody that is, has some kind of inside scoop to know this information. This is all out in the open. And Rob Jessimer is one of Tuberville's top consultants. He is also the guy that was, and I believe actually still is, but Jessimer was the head of Mark Zuckerberg's GOP aide for the FWD group. Now, you may be looking at me going, okay, so he's his Republican aide for the FWD group. What does that even mean? All right, well, here's the explanation for that. The FWD group advocated for amnesty for illegal aliens. It also pushed the Gang of Eight bill to the GOP. In other words, it went around to other GOP senators, GOP congressmen in the House, saying, no, this is a conservative thing. We do want to go in favor of this. And remember that the Gang of Eight bill is the thing that basically destroyed Marco Rubio's credibility on the border because he was a part of the Gang of Eight. And also, the reason that it failed and failed so spectacularly is because it was de facto amnesty. It was giving amnesty to illegals. And so, the bill was just horrible. I remember opposing it myself, and this was back even before I had my own talk show, back when I was on the air, just supporting it as a regular dude. This is one of the worst bills that was written when it came to border policy. It was too radical even for some people that are a lot more accepting of illegal immigrants. They were like, no, that's too far. And then it also, this same group, FWD, pushed for policies to increase the number of foreign guest workers. Now, here's the thing. On its surface, I don't oppose the idea of having more foreign guest workers. If, and only if, those jobs, we have a shortage of those jobs with Americans. So, for example, and every country has, some doctor and nurse shortages, and our shortages are actually far less in the United States. But for example, there are some doctor shortages in the United States. And so if we looked at that, we're like, okay, there's clearly a doctor shortage. What we should do is we should open up the gate for doctors that are outside the country to come in on work visas to come here and practice medicine. Okay, I'm for that. I'm not in principle opposed to guest workers. But the issue here was, and there are reports that showed this in the public record, that what these companies were doing, these big tech companies were doing, and remember, the guy worked for Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, is what these companies were actually doing is, even though there were qualified people in the United States that were looking for work and wanted to fill those positions, they were getting these guest visas and bringing in foreign people that had no connection to America, didn't even necessarily go to college in America, and brought them in so that they could pay them less because they were willing to work for less. Now, I'm all for free trade, and I am for people immigrating legally. But I don't see and understand the logic behind, okay, we have Americans here that want these jobs, but because these big tech companies want cheaper labor, want people that are willing to work for less, we're going to, as a federal government, expedite these people coming in to fill jobs that Americans want. That I do not understand. But that's who this guy who works with the Tuberville administration, one of his top counselors, was doing. That was his job. And this same group also lobbied for a program that rewards companies for hiring H-1B visa workers. H-1B are the highly skilled workers. That's the ones that we were just talking about. And they would expedite them getting green cards. So this is more of the same policy that I was just talking about, where they bring in foreign workers and are able to pay them significantly less than they would the Americans that are qualified and looking for work but now can't get it because there are foreign people that are being expedited and given green cards by the federal government. So this whole thing was orchestrated by one of Tuberville's top consultants. Now, you may look at that and say, well, yeah, but just because his political consultant believes that doesn't mean that Tuberville himself does. That's a fair point. That is a fair argument. However, it is already a little bit sketchy and should at least give you pause to investigate further, and B, I wish that were the case, but the thing is, Tuberville, in some of his speeches, and again, we don't have a voting record to look at because he's never actually been a politician before. He became a politician when he decided to run, but he wasn't before then. And he's never held public office. But unless you think this is just Caleb trying to scare you because he doesn't like one of the counselors, one of the consultants on Tuberville's team, I want you to listen to Tuberville in his own words. This is a clip that came from the Hunts and Nuts podcast. I believe that's one that's based out of Huntsville, if I'm not mistaken. Hence the Hunts. But anyway, this was Tuberville speaking to them. Quote, "First thing, no matter what we do with any immigration law or any path to citizenship, we've got to put up a wall." Okay, so far so good. "We've got to stop the flow of people coming in and out. We've got to know who's here. Then you start going through DACA and all the things in terms of amnesty and figure out what direction we need to go." So in other words, he's saying put up the wall. Okay, I like the wall. You know, Tuberville and I are simpatico on that. But then all of a sudden he says we need to look at these things with DACA and all things in terms of amnesty. In other words, it's all out there. It's all on the docket. We've got to consider amnesty. We've got to look at DACA, maybe doing that. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm in favor of the wall. And I think that Tuberville's right on that, but it scares me that he is so ready and willing to bring amnesty to the table and start talking about amnesty, because I don't know that I can get on board with that. This is another interview done actually by our sister station, by WAPI's Dale Jackson up in Huntsville. So this is a quote from Dale. He asked him a question. Dale asked, "There's a lot of legal immigration that's suppressing wages. Is that a problem too?" Fair question. Tuberville responds with, "Yeah, I think there's going to continue to be a problem, but again, we need workers. Dale, I'm going to tell you, you see homes going up and you don't see Americans." So now Tuberville is parroting a very popular pro-amnesty rhino talking point, and one that is used by the Democrats all the time. The thing is, what we really need are workers, and so because we need workers, we need to be importing more legal immigrants. Now again, Tuberville's not advocating for illegal immigration. He hasn't gone that far, but he is surrounding himself with and coding himself in the language of pro-amnesty, saying that we need workers, that Americans don't want to do these jobs, that we're going to need more workers here because Americans either can't fulfill those roles or don't want to fulfill those roles or whatever. These are common, and by the way, false talking points that come directly from the chamber of crony capitalism. I mean, I see stuff like this said all the time by your establishment types in Washington. He's parroting them almost directly, which is fascinating considering the hallmark of his campaign has been, no, I'm not a politician. I'm something that's very different. I want to drain the swamp. I want to be different than everybody else. But when it comes to talking about amnesty, it's Jeff Sessions that sounds like the opposite of what the swamp wants. And somehow Tommy Tuberville, he keeps talking about all of their policy proposals. He sounds just like a Mitch McConnell. He sounds just like a, what's that other Texas senator? Not Cotton, that's Tennessee. John Cornyn. I mean, he sounds just like those guys. You could transpose this exact quote and say that it came out of one of those guys' mouths, and I would very readily believe it. I wouldn't even notice that something was off. And then this is the one that's the real kicker. This is something that Tuberville said to the Shoals Republican Club last year. Quote, "I'm for the border. Again, I can go through all this. I'm for the border. I've been down there. I've seen it. There are people coming across the border that need jobs, okay, and we want them to come over here. We just need to know who's here, okay, put up the wall. Then we need to let them come in and become citizens like we all became citizens." All right, so a couple of things here. First of all, I didn't become a citizen that way. I'm a natural-born citizen. And I don't think that makes me better or worse than anybody. I'm just saying that it's a little odd to say the way that we all became citizens, considering that I'm pretty sure Tuberville's natural-born too. I don't know if he doesn't understand how the citizenship process works, but I'm a citizen by birth. And I assume that Tuberville is too, but anyway, this is what Tuberville apparently is talking about. And the thing that's really odd about this one is he talks about how for the wall he is, but then he says, but then we're going to let them all come in. Well, that's really strange, because I thought the whole point of having a wall is that we were able to control who comes in and who doesn't. Because if we put up the wall, I want people to be able to come in sometimes. I want to be able to pick and choose and have some people on a merit-based system to be able to come into the country and make our country better. I believe that immigrants do that. And I believe that they do serve a very important role in our society. The illegal ones do not. The illegal ones are criminals. And I'm all for being able to put up a wall, but if we put up the wall and then say, okay, everybody that was going to come in, now you can come in through the gate. Yeah, that's not really an improvement. I mean, don't get me wrong, I guess coming in the gate and being able to see them as they're walking in is helpful, but at the end of the day, your result is the same. And again, this is a very common establishment GOP talking point. That we'll build the wall, but then we'll let everybody in and then give them amnesty. Well, no, that's not a good immigration policy. That's not a winning immigration policy. So Tommy Tuberville can talk about the border all he wants and talk about being great on the border, and he can mention that in his campaign speech and mention it in his speech from winning the primary and coming in first place the other night, because you remember we were covering that. I saw it, and one of the first things he mentioned was the wall. But if you're going to be pro-wall, you need to be pro what the wall represents, which is America does have standards, and you have to abide by our laws, and we will be selective about who we're going to take in. Saying we're going to build the wall, but then let everybody in anyway, well, then there was no point in having the wall. I mean, it's good to have a door on your house, but if you just leave that door wide open and let whoever wants to come in, then there's really no point in having a door. I guess it's better to have a door than not have one. But at the same time, if anybody that wants to come in can come in, having a door really doesn't make a difference. And so this is really the thing that is an issue. He says he's pro-wall, and I take him on his word for that, but let's remember that the Democrats were also pro-wall up until about 2015, and pretty much universally voted for the wall back in 2006. So, yeah, I'm glad he's in favor of the wall, but being in favor of the wall is actually a pretty low bar. Even your Chuck Schumers and your Hillary Clintons and your Nancy Pelosi's were pro-wall less than a decade ago. So let's not pretend that we need to throw Tuberville a party and he's some kind of border hawk just because he favors a wall. If you look at not only who he's spending his time with and who his consultants are, but you also combine that with some of the things that he's saying, it paints a picture of somebody that's really not all that good when it comes to the border. So a couple things that I wanted to mention also on this one, because we've looked at this issue, and I think it's very clear that Jeff Sessions is going to be the better guy when it comes to being able to vote reliably conservative, and also, and I think more importantly, If you're specifically concerned about the wall, then that's something that you're going to want to look at. But that's a little different than what is going to happen, because I've told you what I want to happen, what I think should happen. That's different than what I think will happen. So once we're down to just two candidates here, does Jeff Sessions or Tommy Tuberville win? I think Jeff Sessions has the edge here. And there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, and this is really interesting, with Bradley Byrne gone, Bradley Byrne ate up an awful lot of the votes in the southern part of the state of Alabama. And that area, generally speaking, tends to be pretty conservative with the exception of Mobile. And because of that, the people that are going to be more conservative might lean a little bit more towards Sessions. And the thing is, if those people were voting for Bradley Byrne, they're probably not going to have a problem with voting for somebody that is a politician. And granted, both of them are politicians, but Tuberville's message, at least, is that he's not a politician and he's never been one before in his life. And so the people that were like, oh, I just don't want to vote for somebody that's already held an elected office, those people were not the ones voting for Bradley Byrne, because, of course, Bradley Byrne has also held an office before. So I think being Byrne, and of course him being the third place guy, him not being in the race, I think is going to land a lot of those votes towards Jeff Sessions. So Tuberville did win the other night, but it was neck and neck. And considering I think a lot more of Bradley Byrne's votes are going to wind up going to Sessions instead of Tuberville, I think Tuberville winds up eking out a victory. And that becomes even more interesting when you consider that this happened the other day. The president actually tweeted about Jeff Sessions. So this is the tweet from President Trump, where he says, "This is what happens to someone who loyally gets appointed Attorney General of the United States and then doesn't have the wisdom or courage to stare down and end phony Russia witch hunt. Recuses himself on first day in office, and the Mueller scam begins." So that's President Trump's take on this. A few things about this. First of all, that whole claim there is a complete and utter lie. And anybody that has been watching this, we went by point that if Jeff Sessions had actually not recused himself, he would be in violation of not one, but two federal laws. And so Jeff Sessions had a choice. He could either recuse himself or become a criminal. And so Donald Trump completely wrong on that. But as popular as Donald Trump is, and as popular as that narrative, false as it may be, is in the state of Alabama, maybe Trump finally coming out and speaking against Sessions during these proceedings, during this runoff, does have an effect. I don't know. But here's the reason that I don't think that that's going to be a big issue. Remember that in the past, Donald Trump also backed Big Luther Strange and Roy Moore. Currently, Donald Trump is 0 for 2. And one of the very few things that is consistent about the Alabama voters is they do not like people that are outside the state of Alabama telling them what to do and how to vote. And I think that that's one of the big reasons that Roy Moore and Luther Strange, them getting the nod from Trump, really didn't help them all that much. We all know what eventually happened in that race. And ultimately, I don't think that Trump is going to be able to have a serious impact. I think that any impact that he would have had, he kind of already had. And the fact that there was a large plurality of people that have decided that whatever happened between President Trump and Attorney General Sessions evidently doesn't matter as much as I thought it would. I honestly thought that Jeff Sessions would not be able to pull this off because of how many people in Alabama that I have talked to that didn't like Sessions and thought that he handled that incorrectly. And I don't know if maybe they all just listened to my podcast and realized they were wrong about that or what, or they've just forgiven him or what's going on. But it looks like the people of Alabama, at least based on the numbers that I'm seeing and based on recent polling, that they've more or less forgiven Jeff Sessions for that. Or, maybe the voices that were saying that Jeff Sessions was some kind of traitor to Trump, maybe those people just weren't as abundant as we originally thought that they were. So I just don't see Tuberville winning that one. Now, on the other side of this, we have Jeff Coleman versus Barry Moore. And unfortunately, I do not think that this one is going to be nearly as easy because I want Sessions to win in the runoff. On the other one, I don't think that the result that I want is going to happen in this particular race, and I'll explain why. Because if you watched my special Tuesday or on Monday where I was talking about who would be my picks on the ballot, you know that I was pulling pretty hardcore for Barry Moore. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up in this, because looking at the tea leaves and trying to figure out what's going to happen in this race, well, this one's going to be a very uphill battle for Moore, and I'm going to explain why. Jessica Taylor, who wound up barely getting beat by Moore in the runoff, I mean, this thing was literally less than a percentage point difference. Jessica Taylor ran an incredibly tough campaign. I was actually very shocked that she was able to come out of literally nowhere and wind up coming in a very, very close third place to Barry Moore. And because of that, looking at Jessica Taylor, she wound up garnering just shy of 20%, but it's about 20%. We'll just round up. She wound up garnering about 20% of the vote. And then you have Terry Hasdorf, who got 5% of the vote. Also a fantastic candidate. I would have very easily voted for her. She was really impressive. I encourage you to go back and watch my interview with her if you get a chance at some point. But I think that they wind up going for Barry Moore. In other words, I think that the voters that went for them are more likely to lean towards Barry Moore. I don't see a lot of the Jessica Taylor voters or the Terry Hasdorf voters, the people that tend to be a little bit better informed, the ones that actually know who they're voting for and care a lot more about conservative principles and a conservative record. I think that those people are going to wind up going largely, probably not entirely, but largely for Barry Moore on this, which, you know, I think is a good thing. Your Troy King voters, I think, wind up going for Jeff Coleman. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, your Jeff Coleman voters probably voted for him because of name recognition. I mean, this guy dumped tons of money into advertising. And for a little bit there, it almost felt like his advertising campaign that he was trying to rival Alexander Shinaro when it came to billboards. I mean, he wasn't nearly at Bloomberg levels, but the guy was buying a crap ton of advertising, which I'm fine with. I mean, he bought a lot of advertising on the stations at Cumulus Montgomery, and hey, Jeff, by all means, buy as many as you want, my buddy. I'm still going to speak my mind on you. That's not going to buy you any sympathy with me, but by all means, spend as much money as you want on News Radio 1440 and our other sister stations. But I think the fact that he did buy all that advertising gave him really good voting ID. He outspent his opponents about 4-1. And so that really bolstered the name ID, and a lot of people that voted for Troy King can't tell you a single thing that he's done. And a lot of them probably wouldn't have voted for Troy King if they did know some of the things that he's done. But they just went with voter ID. They looked down the ballot, they recognized the name, they marked it in. And so because of that, the people that voted that way are far more likely to vote in favor of Jeff Coleman. Now, you also look at that in terms of the ones that don't mind that very polished, very plastic-looking politician that seems to, you know, fit the stereotypical mold of what a politician's supposed to look like and sound like. I mean, that's Jeff Coleman to a T. And so, despite the fact that he says 10,000 times in every interview, I'm not a politician. Well, yeah, you are, A, and B, you look about as much like a politician as any human being possibly could. And Troy King has that same quality. So I think what you're going to see is a lot of the people that leaned more towards Troy King are going to be the ones that lean a lot more towards Jeff Coleman, and the ones that apparently don't care about scandals, because we all know some of the insane stuff that Troy King got busted for as the Attorney General, and then, of course, Jeff Coleman defrauding the military of several $100,000. Well, it makes sense that people that don't care about that kind of stuff and don't care about integrity would probably wind up going for a Jeff Coleman. And so the reason I say that Barry Moore has a much tougher time is You put Jessica Taylor's 20% and Terry Hasdorf's 25%, and you combine it with Barry Moore's 20%, you're left with 45% voting for Barry Moore. And if you combine Troy King's voters, 15% with Jeff Coleman's 48%, you get 53%. You see why that's a pretty big uphill climb for Barry Moore? Even if he gets every single voter from Jessica Taylor and Terry Hasdorf, I don't see him getting very many Troy King votes. I really have a hard time believing a lot of Troy King voters are going to go for Barry Moore the second time around. And so Barry Moore, he's got 4 weeks to do something spectacular, and he better do it pretty quickly, or he's going to lose this race. He has a much, much tougher climb than Jeff Sessions and Tuberville, and I mean, you would guess that just based on the numbers that they got in the primaries, because Sessions barely finished below Tommy Tuberville, whereas Barry Moore finished a very distant second, and barely even finished second. He almost came in third to Jeff Coleman, and so a lot can change in 4 weeks, but if we're being perfectly honest, I don't expect a whole lot to change in 4 weeks. I don't expect the massive tidal wave of change that Barry Moore is going to need to be able to make up that distance. I hope I'm wrong, but to be honest, I don't think I am. What we're going to do is we're going to go to a break real quick, and we will be back. We have a brand new Social Justice Warrior Bible that we've never debuted on the show, so look forward to that. Enjoy.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible, the only Bible printed on 100% organic biodegradable paper. Today's reading comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, verses 3 through 10. And it says, Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And he answered and said, Have you not read on your Bible apps that he who created him from the beginning made them male and female, and trans, and pansexual, and non-binary, and Jupiter gender, or one of the 150 other options? And said, For this reason, a man/woman/other shall leave Z's father and mother, or father and father, or mother and mother, or two mothers, father, and their special friend Sequoia, and be joined to his wife, or wives, or husband, or life partners, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer 2 or 3 or 14, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. I mean, unless of course it's like super difficult, or there's money problems, or bedroom problems, or you meet somebody that you like better, or that initial spark goes away and you just fall out of love, or you're just unhappy for any reason, then divorce is totally understandable. They said to him, Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? He said to them, Because Moses wasn't woke enough. He was some rich, spoiled prince who was probably white and a tool of the patriarchy. So why do you care what he thinks? And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman, it's totally cool with God as long as you're happy. That is all God wants, after all. The disciples said to him, That sounds super convenient. Thanks, Jesus. Wow. So inspirational. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
And welcome back. Thanks so much for being with us here on Tactics. It is always a pleasure to have you here on the show with us. And we have, as usual, we have to talk about the fallout of the elections. That's what we've been doing really the entirety of this show. But I do want to talk a little bit about the Democrat presidential fallout, because Super Tuesday had some pretty interesting and some would even argue cataclysmic results with this. And of course, Biden wound up winning big in Alabama. We knew that pretty early on in the night. It didn't take very long at all for them to declare it in favor of Biden, and that's expected given Alabama's polling had showed for quite some time that Biden was an overwhelming favorite in Alabama. So since Alabama was a big part of putting Biden on top in the delegates for the Democrat nomination, and he is likely to be the Democrat nominee, I just wanted to remind Democrats that this is the guy who is very likely to be the guy you're going to run against Donald Trump to be president. And if that's the case, this is what Donald Trump is going to have to contend with.
Hey, this is my little sister Valerie, and I'm Jill's husband. Oh no, you switched on me. This is my wife. This is my sister. They switched on me.
So Joe Biden, at the beginning of his big Super Tuesday victory speech, he forgets which one is his wife and his sister. I don't know. Maybe that's the reason that he did so well in Alabama. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I can say that because I'm from here. But anyway, no, so he just gets mixed up. And the thing is, that's something that could probably happen to anybody. They didn't switch on him. He just called out the wrong one. He forgot which one was on which side. And that could happen to anybody. But in the context of Biden's tendency to have gaffes constantly, I think that does make a big difference in that if this were a one-off thing, that this was just something that happened to Joe Biden this one time, it's still funny, but it's not like indicative of anything else. With Joe Biden, this is just another Tuesday, not a Super Tuesday, just a normal Tuesday for Joe Biden coming across it. I'm sure the guy's tired and he's had a long day and everything, but still, that's a mistake you really shouldn't make. And I love that he hears from behind his wife saying, no, I'm your wife or something to that effect. And then it throws him off and he's hearing that. He's like, and I'm Jill's husband. Wait, what? So he's just completely at a loss. But that's not even the most egregious Joe Biden gaffe. And I'm not just talking about of all time. I'm talking about just this week. Joe Biden had another gaffe that was actually even worse because it dealt with the Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.
So Joe Biden just loses it with the Declaration of Independence. I got to see that again. Come on. One more time.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.
You know the thing, the Declaration of Independence thing. Oh, guy cracks me up. Again, the first clip that I was showing you was Super Tuesday and him starting that victory speech. Like I said, that's something that could happen to anybody. You kind of look the other way. Everybody, could have that, and especially it's a big moment. You're trying to get up on stage as quick as possible and whatever, and you just get them mixed up behind you. That could happen. But the Declaration of Independence, this guy's been a senator since 1812 and was the vice president of our country. He should be able to quote the Declaration of Independence, especially arguably the most famous line in it. He's like, all men created something, you know the thing. Joe Biden's mind is gone. And I, despite all of this, remember, this just happened this week. This isn't even including the thousands of other clips of Joe Biden going off the rails, the hairy legs and the roaches comment that we talked about earlier this year. Or I mean, there's hundreds of these things where he's asking. I think my personal favorite is where he's asking the guy in the wheelchair to stand up. Or him going around and creepily sniffing kids or all the other crazy stuff. Despite all of this, and despite the fact that the guy clearly is exhibiting that he's getting kind of long in the tooth. And I don't want to belittle, because I do think that he genuinely has a touch of dementia, and I'm not trying to in any way degrade that. I mean, I've had family members that went through that, and it's an incredibly sad, difficult thing to watch. And right now, it seems to be that it's not affecting him in the sense that I don't think that the guy's like completely, can't find his own house or anything like that. I don't think that he has like full onset Alzheimer's, but he's clearly lost a few steps. And despite this, you're not going to see what you saw with President Trump, where there are going to be hordes of psychiatrists in a revolving door coming on and talking about how, in my professional opinion, he's just not fit for the office of president. That's not something you're going to see. That's just not something you're going to see. MSNBC and the other big alphabet soup networks, that's not something they're going to discuss. You're not going to see op-eds by clinical psychologists in the New York Times or the Washington Post talking about how can we really trust somebody that has exhibited possible signs of mental illness with the nuclear codes. That's not a thing that is going to happen. I mean, they could have wheeled Joe Biden up in a wheelchair with a string of drool coming down his mouth and he can't eat solid food anymore, and you would not see that happening. That is just not a thing that will take place. Because the media has a very clear liberal bias, and if this is their only shot to defeat Donald Trump, they don't care if they have to bring the guy up on a respirator. They'll take it. So that's one of the things that you're going to see. And again, I don't wish Joe Biden any ill will. I understand dementia. My grandmother specifically went through this, and it was a horribly sad thing to watch her lose her identity and lose who she was slowly. And I don't want to in any way belittle that, and I hope that that does not happen to Joe Biden. But I'm just saying, we do have to think about the country, and a guy that clearly isn't, his elevator doesn't quite go all the way to the top. I don't think that we can trust the country to that, but this is the person whom the Democrats have selected to be their nominee for this. And one thing that was really fascinating is that essentially all the other Democrats decided to kamikaze themselves right before Super Tuesday in order to rally the anti-Bernie coalition behind one person. Elizabeth Warren did not do that for her friend, Bernie Sanders, who is a horrible sexist that thinks women can't be president, despite the fact that there's no evidence whatsoever that Bernie ever said that. That Joe Biden was perceived as being the only guy that might be able to beat Bernie, and if Bernie wins, then Trump basically gets an automatic W and is president for 4 more years. And they said, well, we can't let that happen, and so they all one by one decided to kamikaze themselves and drop out of the race. You saw it with Klobuchar, you saw it with Buttigieg, you saw it with Mike Bloomberg. They all just kind of, well, actually, I think Mike Bloomberg hung in for Super Tuesday. I believe I've got the timeline right on that. But they all just dropped out. No, actually, I think he did drop out beforehand. So that they all dropped out immediately, saying, well, what we've got to do is we've got to just all rally behind Joe Biden and make sure that Bernie Sanders does not win this. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Caleb, I'm more than 4 years old. I remember in 2016 that essentially you had the same thing with President Trump and Ted Cruz, and the difference is your Marco Rubios and your John Kasich's and everybody else did not drop out and allow Ted Cruz to sort of rally his supporters behind him before Super Tuesday, or really well into days after Super Tuesday, and several primaries afterward. There were still several candidates in it. Why is that? Why is it when it came to the establishment Democrat Party, they all rallied behind Biden, and they didn't do the same thing for Cruz? Well, there's 2 reasons for that. The first being that the establishment despises Ted Cruz. The establishment likes Joe Biden. That makes a difference. I'm not saying that it's the only thing that makes a difference. I don't even think it's the primary reason that you saw that happening. But the establishment, they wanted Jeb. And when they couldn't get Jeb, they wanted Marco. And when it became abundantly clear that they were not going to get Marco, they still didn't want Ted Cruz, and they kind of figured, well, if we get Trump or Cruz, that's really a loss for us, so we're going to rally as much support as we can behind Marco Rubio, and maybe there's a way down the road that he ekes this thing out, and of course it just never happened. But the other reason, and I think this is actually the larger reason that took place, it comes down to a difference in the way that Republicans and Democrats think. We're very different creatures by nature, and one of the differences between us is that Republicans tend to think in an individualistic term. So in other words, when we think about economic policy, our ideas normally, again, there's some rhinos that are an exception to this, but normally what Republicans think of is, let's empower the individual. Let's let the individual go out, make their own decisions, make their own mistakes, and make their own profit and benefit from those things. And then that will be the way that our economic policy is run. We'll let people make their own choices, their own decisions. Democrats don't think that way. Democrats think as though they are a collective. That's why when it comes to things like healthcare or the economy, they think everything should be run by the community, that people should get together and decide things, as opposed to people making their own decisions. And I'm not saying that every single Democrat and every single rank-and-file Republican uphold these ideals. I'm saying as a general rule, this is the truth. I have a buddy of mine that is a Bernie supporter, and he's actually pretty individualistic. He's a good friend of mine, fraternity brother. He and I have some really interesting political discussions, but he's very much an individualist like me. Not as much as me, but he is a little bit more leaning on the individualistic side compared to especially most Democrats, and interestingly enough, he still is a Bernie supporter, which I find fascinating. But the Democrats, as a general rule, and he admitted to this, they tend to think like a collective. That's just how they operate. Republicans operate in a way that I'm going to do what's best for the individual, and when they are the individual, they say, well, we'll do what's best for me, and then people make their own decision, and that's how we'll hash it out. And I'm not attributing any moral good or bad to either one of these lines of thinking. I'm just saying that this is the way that they tend to operate. I'm saying this purely as an observation. And because of that, your Marco Rubios and your John Kasich's, why should they opt out? I mean, it doesn't benefit them to drop out, so why would they do it? With the Democrats, the Democrat Party, the Democrat machine, the community has essentially decided that Joe Biden is the guy, so we need to honor that, and in order to do what's best for the party, we'll do what doesn't necessarily benefit us individually. That's the mindset that Democrats have, and that's the reason that they're more apt to do something like they did. Now, Elizabeth Warren did not do that to rally support to her friend Bernie, because, of course, she's a terrible, horrible, a terrible person and doesn't care about anybody but herself. And I'm saying that in terms of personal animus as well. But speaking of that, I think one of the most interesting things that came out of all this is that the stock market all of a sudden decided to surge directly after Super Tuesday. Especially, the biggest boon of the day was the healthcare industry. So apparently, the fear that Bernie Sanders was going to be president was pretty much over at the end of Super Tuesday, and all of a sudden the market, which is run largely on speculation of what they believe will happen in the future, it runs on predictions of that. The market started doing an awful lot better. Didn't springboard back as good as it was beforehand, but still, I mean, it made some massive recoveries. And I'm not saying that's the only factor, but the fact that Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All was not going to show up, I think played a significant role in that. Because if you're an investor and you think Bernie Sanders is likely to be the next president, well, then why would you start putting an awful lot of money into healthcare? And if he's not going to be president, why wouldn't you throw some money that way? And so I think that just makes common sense. Now, Elizabeth Warren did stick in the race before Super Tuesday, but has since dropped out. That actually happened, I think, a little before noon today. So this is pretty recent news that Elizabeth Warren has suspended her campaign. She's finally out after not winning, or really, I don't think she received any delegates from Super Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken. She wound up coming, third or even fourth in some races, fourth to people that, didn't get any delegates either in certain states. So really did not have a good night for Elizabeth Warren, and it could not happen to a more terrible person. But she does have an explanation for why she lost. And her explanation, I know I don't have to tell you. I know you already guessed it. I know that you're sitting there in front of your computer screen congratulating yourself that you already know what the answer is. And, props to you. Yeah, it's sexism. So here's Elizabeth Warren explaining that.
Gender in this race, that is the trap question for every woman. If you say, yeah, there was sexism in this race, everyone says whiner. And if you say, no, there was no sexism, about a bazillion women think, what planet do you live on? I promise you this, I'll have a lot more to say on that subject later on.
Senator.
All right, so Senator Elizabeth Warren explaining how it was really a bunch of evil, evil sexists that hate women that are the reason that she did not win this race, which is hilarious on a number of levels. But first and foremost, it really just puts on display how she really is Hillary Clinton 2.0. And I know that a whole bunch of people are going to be like, especially liberals that watch this, are like, oh, you're only saying that because she's a woman. No, I'm saying that because she's very Hillary Clinton-esque. And Kristen Gillibrand, same kind of mold. But you know who's not like not like Hillary Clinton? Who's not like Hillary Clinton is Tulsi Gabbard. And even though there are a handful of similarities, really Amy Klobuchar's not that much like Hillary Clinton in terms of being a candidate. And yet, when it comes to that, I just think that the personality, the grating, nagging, kind of shrill voice and the way that they talk down to people and assume that the whole world's against them and that they're victims no matter what happens. Amy Klobuchar doesn't really play that shtick. I mean, she'll talk about sexism, but at least from what I've seen, it's not something that is a continuing theme that you're about, you're 100% sure that at least half of her talking points are going to revolve around the fact that she's a woman. Klobuchar does it occasionally, but she doesn't do it all the time like Gillibrand and Clinton and Warren do. And Tulsi Gabbard barely does it at all. And so I'm not saying that because she's a woman. I'm saying that because it's the truth. And another thing, too, it's kind of hilarious considering she believes that sexism is the reason for her spectacular defeat when you consider that in her home state of Massachusetts, the one that, you should win. I've always said that winning your home state in a presidential primary, it's a nice thing. It's kind of like getting a Valentine from your mom. Like, it's a good thing to get, but you also don't brag about it. It's like you don't go to other people bragging about, because like Marco Rubio had the same thing unfortunately happen to him in the primary with Florida, which wound up going for Trump. John Kasich went around bragging about, oh, I won Ohio's primary. I was like, dude, you're the governor there. Of course you won that primary. But Elizabeth Warren didn't even get that. And not only did she not win Massachusetts, she lost in women. That's right, exit polling in Massachusetts showed that Joe Biden, in her home state, beat Elizabeth Warren by 10 percentage points. So the idea that it's sexism, yeah, I'm going to have to go with the no. That's a pretty definitive thing to say, that there's a whole lot of women that just didn't like Elizabeth Warren because she's Elizabeth Warren, not because she has lady parts. And another thing, too, did she, forget that Hillary Clinton was the nominee 4 years ago? Is that something that she just, slipped her mind? That 4 years ago there was a candidate that was very similar to her in a lot of ways, and also considering that she was a woman, that wound up being the nominee. It's almost like she's completely forgotten that. And I think probably the most hilarious thing about this is that really, she is accusing Democrats of sexism. Because this was not a statewide or a nationwide vote. This was a vote among several states. And the same results basically from the earlier primaries as well. This is a vote from several states of Democrat voters. Republicans in most of these states are not even allowed to vote in these. Many of them don't even have open primaries. And yet she's claiming that somehow there's sexism. Well, if that's the case, and sexism is the reason that she did not win these, she's saying that the rank-and-file Democrat voters are sexist. Make no mistake, that is what she is saying. She is accusing Democrats of sexism. Now, I don't think that that's ridiculous. I don't think it's outlandish. But I do think it's hysterical that a top contender for the Democrat nomination for president is saying, Democrats are all a bunch of sexists, and that's the reason you didn't vote for me. That I find pretty funny. And technically speaking, because she was talking about earlier that there were no women left in the race and that that's a sad commentary on the Democrat Party, Tulsi is still in there. Like, I get that she doesn't have a chance at this point, and she doesn't have any delegates, but she is technically still in the race, so there is still a woman in there. But yeah, by and large, we have distilled the field down to two geriatric old white men, which I find pretty hysterical. I did want to bring this to your attention, though, because this was just absolutely fantastic, and I really had to share this with you. So the Babylon Bee actually put this article up, and I don't know who exactly is running the Babylon Bee, but whatever they are getting paid, I'm just going to go ahead and say it right now. Whatever they are getting paid is not enough. Whoever is in charge of writing stories at the Babylon Bee, they are truly doing the Lord's work, because what they are getting done there, what they are accomplishing there, is definitely worthy of praise. So here's the headline from the Babylon Bee. Let's take a look at that. Warren returns to the tribe in shame after failing to take back land from the Paleface. Oh, man. I love the picture there, too, with her with the white flag. That's Mel Brooks level of humor. I'm sorry. I don't care who you are. That's hysterical. And as usual, I don't usually read stuff from the Babylon Bee, because I figure if you want to read the Babylon Bee, you'll go there yourself. So, and I feel almost like I'm stealing their jokes, but this one was just way too good to pass up. Here's the headline from the Babylon Bee. Cherokee Nation. Great intro. Cherokee Nation. Having dropped out of the presidential race, Elizabeth Warren rode in solitude back to her reservation, having failed to take the land back from the Palefaces. Quote, "I am sorry, my people, I have failed," she said somberly, a single tear running down her cheek. "The white man still holds our land, and the very trees cry out against them. May the Great Spirit grant us another chance and for a harvest." The Cherokee people looked confused, so she clarified, "That means 4 years according to the Indian talk book I picked up." The Cherokee expressed mixed emotions seeing Warren return from "Who are you?" to "How many times are we going to have to tell you that if you're not going to play some slots at the casino, you're going to have to leave?" Warren nodded, accepting her banishment from the once great place among the Cherokee people. Quote, "I accept my punishment and vow never to return until the sun once again never sets on the Cherokee Nation. As I depart, let me simply ask you if you have ever heard the wolf cry to the blue corn moon, or asked the grinning bobcat why it grins." Wait, now you're just quoting Pocahontas, one tribal security guard said. All right, lady, let's go. At publishing time, Warren had sought the advice of Grandmother Willow, who she should endorse. If there was a Nobel Prize for comedy, that should be a nominee this year. I gotta tell you, that is absolutely fantastic. Props to the people at the Babylon Bee. And I do think it's pretty hilarious that ultimately we have started this race with a large group of old white people, and now we have distilled it to two old white men, which we're constantly told by those on the left are the source of all the world's problems and need to be cast out of polite society. So I find that pretty amusing myself. Let's go to the Daily Dose of Stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
So for today's Daily Dose of Stupid, Chuck Schumer, yes, that Chuck Schumer, the one who is the House Minority Leader, the Senate Minority Leader right now. Okay, that's not quite a Joe Biden gaffe, but, it is a gaffe that I will correct myself on. He is the Senate Minority Leader, and the other day he actually threatened 2 of the Supreme Court justices. And I do find this whole scenario kind of funny because, especially with your older politicians, and I know that they grew up in a different world and that they learned to do things and learned to operate politically in a different landscape. So I understand that part of this is at least not their fault. It's just kind of how they've developed. But they operate as though there's not a freaking camera on everybody's phone and that every single thing that they say in a public place is going to be recorded and wind up on the evening news. Like, I think I see that a lot more with older politicians, and you don't see it as much with younger politicians. Now, with AOC, she definitely has an awareness of that. She just constantly says stupid things anyway. But with Chuck Schumer, it seems as though he hides what he really thinks when he's on C-SPAN, but he forgets that when he's out talking to special interest groups and people that are typically considered allies, that those same people are still probably going to post that video online, not thinking anything about it, because they're not exactly the sharpest knife in the drawer either. And even when he's speaking to a group like this it is a pro-abortion group, that he has to watch what he says because this is going to wind up on film, it's going to wind up on the internet, and then people can scrutinize it. And in this particular case, there's a second reason why, not just criticism from the other side, but there's actually a legal reason why Chuck Schumer should have been far more cautious with his words than he is in this particular clip. So we'll watch this. This is, like I said, Chuck Schumer speaking to a pro-abortion group.
I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions.
All right, so Chuck Schumer actually coming out and threatening Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, saying that there's going to be a price to pay, that you are not going to know what hit you, you have unleashed the whirlwind, all these other kinds of flowery ways of threatening them. And the big thing here, and this has been brought to the attention, I know I'm not the first person to talk about this, but threatening federal judges of any level of the court is a crime. And of course, the Supreme Court would be included in that. 18 U.S. Code 115, and I'm going to read the language directly. Whoever threatens to assault, kidnap, murder, or murder a United States official, a United States judge, a federal law enforcement officer, or an official whose killing would be a crime under such section, with intent to impede, intimidate, or interfere with such official, judge, or law enforcement officer while engaged in the performance of official duties, or with the intent to retaliate against such official, judge, or law enforcement officer on account of the performance of official duties, shall be punished as provided in the subsection. And the subsection, of course, is just essentially the penalties that can be brought against somebody if they engage in this activity. But this is a federal crime. And if you look at what this federal crime says, it meets all of the qualifications. It says if you do any of these things, assault, murder, or, intimidation, with intent to impede, intimidate, or interfere in their official duties, well, Judge Kavanaugh and Judge Gorsuch are duly appointed and installed justices of the Supreme Court, and he specifically said there that if you do this, if you make this decision on a case that you hear as Supreme Court justices, then you are going to pay a price for that. I mean, I don't see how that's not textbook intimidation, specifically in the functions of their job and their ability to perform, trying to influence a judge to rule a way that you find preferable, and saying that if they do not do this, then you are going to come after them and they are going to be paying a price. Now, granted, that threat is somewhat vague. So he doesn't specifically say, like, we're going to stab you or we're going to kill you or anything like that. And so that would have been far more direct. And so it's a little gray on the area of, okay, did he actually threaten to assault them? Did he actually threaten them with physical harm or something like that? Well, no, he didn't technically do that. It's a veiled threat, but it is a threat nonetheless, specifically in the functions of their duties. So because of that, and because it is a little bit vague, here's what I think ought to happen, because this is incredibly serious. I don't think that necessarily you have to take it to the level of Chuck Schumer should be prosecuted, because like I said, it's kind of vague, and a prosecutor, I'm not sure that you could make a good case that this would be a good use of taxpayer money to investigate this specifically. Because I don't think that you're going to uncover some kind of secret conspiracy that Chuck Schumer was like hiring assassins to go after Kavanaugh and Gorsuch. I don't think you're going to find that or anything of that nature. But I think that it is fair that this is not something that a senator should be saying, and especially not somebody that is the minority leader. And so he should at the very least lose his position as minority leader, if not lose his Senate seat. I think that that would be appropriate reaction to this. And by the way, you know how pro-abortion I am. You know how pro-life I am and how anti-abortion I am. But if there was a pro-abortion piece of legislation, or there was a case that came before the Supreme Court, and there were anybody that was saying, you know what, we're coming after you if you pass this legislation, or we're coming after you if you rule on the pro-abortion side of this case, that person does not need to hold a public office, or especially a particular office of prestige like Speaker of the House or something like that. Like, if Mitch McConnell, granted I'm not a huge Mitch McConnell fan, so this isn't a great example, it's just the only one I can think of. If Mitch McConnell had threatened a Supreme Court justice and said, look here, Ginsburg, you better rule on the pro-life side of this, or I'm coming after you. You will reap the whirlwind, and there is going to be a price to pay. You're not going to know what hits you. I'd say, yeah, Mitch McConnell needs to step down as majority leader. And he may actually need to step down from his Senate seat for something like that. That's not something you do. You don't threaten a judge to make a decision the way that you think he ought to rule and say that you're going to face consequences for that. Now, since then, Chuck Schumer did a famous politician apology, not apology, sorry, not sorry routine, where he basically said, I shouldn't have used that specific language, and he tried to walk it back and saying, well, I was talking about paying a political cost. I don't think that you could make that case. That doesn't sound like what he was talking about, but I can't definitively say that wasn't what he was talking about. And the reason that I say that that's odd to say that they're going to pay a political cost is because they're judges. And even if you march past the idea that judges don't have a political leaning because, you know, they're human beings and they see the world a certain way. So let's just ignore the fact that they're not supposed to see things in a political light, which, you know, ideally they're not. Let's just look past that and say, but they're also not elected. They're lifetime appointments. And so how can they pay a political price for that? That doesn't make any sense. What would be the political cost to a judge? That's the whole reason that we have judges with lifetime appointments, is that there is no political price to be paid for that. They don't make decisions based on the political fallout, or at least they're not supposed to. And so Chuck Schumer saying that is a really poor defense. Like, if he had said exactly the same thing to legislation when it came to a senator that was going to vote a certain way on a bill, it's still inappropriate. It's still something that Chuck Schumer should not be doing. But at least if his defense is, well, I was talking about the political cost. Okay, that makes a little more sense. There's not really a political cost for a judge, and that's why it's a very odd thing to use as your defense, saying that there's a political price to be paid when they're justices, they're not elected officials. But here's the thing. ultimately, this is what it all comes down to. Even if you're ignoring all the legality of it, even if you're ignoring the fact that Chuck Schumer really should face some kind of severe penalty for this, even looking past all that, looking sheerly at the content of what he was saying, let's say that there were actually a political cost to the justices for this, that they were going to pay that political price for whatever it is that they are going to do if they're going to rule in an anti-abortion way, which with Kavanaugh, I'm not even all that convinced that he's going to. But anyway, that aside for the moment, let's assume that what Chuck Schumer is saying is correct. Let's assume that every word of that was right. That pales in comparison. Even if there were a price to be paid, my immediate response would be, well, even if there is, that's a price I'm willing to pay, if it means I don't have to pay the eternal price that you're going to have to pay for supporting it. And that's where that conversation would end between me and Chuck Schumer. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's report today comes from the book of Joshua, specifically the 24th chapter, and this is a really famous verse. When I read it, you're going to probably immediately recognize it. You're going to know where it comes from. And I just wanted to make you aware of an aspect of it that I don't think we talk about as much as we should. But this week being an election week, this week being one where we are made more aware than we normally are of both our choices and the decisions that we make and the consequences of those choices, I thought going back to this verse, I don't know, it just felt appropriate. And because of that, I just decided to go with my gut and talk about this a little bit. And maybe part of it is also because Faulkner's lectureships, which went on this week, which, by the way, very difficult for me to do both Faulkner's lectures and have an election week on the same week, but so worth it. I mean, just phenomenal programs, phenomenal speakers going on all week here. Very, very good lectureship, and if you got to attend some of the sessions here, you know what I'm talking about. But it was primarily on the Old Testament and the way that Israel had this back and forth with God, that they were constantly trying to do a little better, and then they would wind up falling away and ignoring God, and then they'd call out for him to help him, and then he'd show up and help them, and they'd be back on top again, and then they'd get lazy and forget him again, and it was this vicious cycle that just kept going and kept going and kept going. And it's easy to look at that and be very aware of our human nature and very aware of that not really changing in the past, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years. And because of that and understanding that, say, is there really any hope for us? Are we just doomed to repeat this cycle for all of eternity? Or at least until the end of time when we go and enter into eternity? And to a degree, I think the answer is actually yes. But being distraught about that, I think, robs us, or at least being distraught about that is the product of us not having proper perspective here. So let's go ahead and look at our key text of the evening, John 24:15, where it says here, "If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." So at the end of this book, you have Joshua presenting them with a very clear choice. You have the opportunity to serve the gods which your fathers served, over there when we were wandering around in the wilderness. In other words, the idols of the people over the Jordan River, or you could serve the ones that are here in the land that you're living now. And I think that that in some ways is a commentary on how Joshua sees himself in contrast to the rest of Israel. And that's the reason he's using this strong language. Joshua's been doing this for a very long time. He hasn't been the leader his whole life, but he has been right by Moses' side ever since the Exodus. And so he has watched these people constantly see wonder after wonder after wonder be delivered by God, be given signs, be told to worship God, and then, for a little while being very faithful and then falling right back into idolatry. And they did it before they crossed the Jordan River. They did it after they crossed the Jordan River to take the promised land. It seemed to be a constant thing with Israel that idolatry was always a pet sin of theirs. Joshua's tired of it. And this is such a basic thing that he's looking at it and watching them, and he's saying, look, you can serve the gods that your family did, that they were going off and serving other gods and other idols across the river. You can serve the gods that are here that you are falling away from and serving now instead of the God that you're supposed to. Do what you want. My house is following God. And there's a couple lessons that we can draw from that. Like most choices, we can't make them for other people. When it comes to elections, or really any other choice in our life, there are going to be people that make bad decisions. They're going to make choices that we're looking at a situation they're in and saying, how can you do that? It's obvious what the right choice is. Why won't you do that? But we have to be aware of the fact, and we have to really be content with the idea and make peace with the idea that we can't control them. Much as we may want to help them, much as we may want to make a decision for them because we want what's best for them, ultimately, they got to make their own choices. And we can't control what other people do. We can control what we do. And we can control the places that we have influence over. If you're a dad and you're charged with being the head of your family, you can do that to the best of your capacity. If you're a mom, even if you have a husband that's not following God the way that he should, you can at least make sure that your kids are on the right path and that they hear the truth. If you're a kid, and this is a really difficult situation to be in, maybe you can't control what your parents do, but you can at least control what you believe and what you do. Maybe you're a guy like me that doesn't really have a family. Well, making sure that my household follows God is pretty simple. I just have to make sure that I'm following God. Simple. Didn't say easy, said simple. Sometimes I struggle with that one myself. I can barely keep track of what I'm doing. But ultimately, that's what it comes down to. Do the best you can with your sphere of influence. Now, Joshua is not saying ignore everybody else around you, just worry about the people in your house, because Joshua's been having this fight his whole life, and he's saying ultimately, look, I can't make you follow God. I can't make you be faithful to him. I can't make you believe in only him and ignore these other idols. But what I can do is make sure that my house is right with God. And the second thing I think we can take from that is to tend your garden first. Tend your garden. What's the very first thing that Adam was told to do? Even before Eve entered into his life, he had a job. He had to tend the garden that God gave him. He had a responsibility to take care of the things that God gave him control over. And at that point, nobody else's spiritual well-being other than his was his to worry about. So all he had to do was the task that God gave him. And whether you're single or you've got, a wife and 15 kids, the first thing you have to do is tend your garden, just like Joshua. Joshua knew that his garden was his primary responsibility. Doesn't mean he doesn't have a responsibility to Israel. He has a big responsibility to Israel. But he knew that making sure his garden was kept correctly first was the most important thing, because if his house is going crazy and his kids are rebellious and worshiping idols and his wife is doing the same thing, how's he going to get Israel to listen to him? Why do you think in the Pauline epistles that one of the preconditions for an elder is that they have godly, faithful children. Even a single guy like me that, would love to be an elder one day. If I don't get married and have kids, not in the cards for me. And you know what? That's okay. Because if you can't keep your own house in order, and if you've never managed that and dealt with that, how can you be expected to lead other people to do the same? This is something that is a continuing theme through the Bible. By the way, this is something Joshua had firsthand experience in. Because you remember the story of Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's rebellious sons that ignored God's precepts and didn't obey him and wound up getting consumed by fire from heaven because they refused to obey and treat with reverence God's worship. He knew what that was like. And he knew that Aaron, and I don't know if it was really Aaron's fault or not, I tend to think he bore at least some responsibility. He didn't make sure that he and his house were following the world and following the Lord and following it with their whole heart. And because of that, it tore his family a new one. I mean, it didn't destroy his family, but it certainly had to be a horrible thing to have to view and witness and then have to live with the fallout of that afterward. And Joshua doesn't want that to happen to his house, and so he decides to do something different than what Aaron did and make sure that his house is on the right path. And then the third lesson I think we can take from that is do not let your surroundings drag you down. Joshua understood, and probably felt like, based on the language of this verse, that he was the only person that had this mentality. That he was the only one that was like, we've got to follow the Lord and only the Lord, and we're going to follow his commandments, follow his precepts, which, by the way, the first one is that I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. I mean, that's like the introduction. And the children of Israel couldn't even get that right. Now, I'm not saying don't be influenced by outside sources. Having a group of Christian friends, Christian family around you to support you, that understand what you're going through, that try to propel you forward, please be influenced by those people. That's part of the design of the church and the reason that God put it into place. So I'm not saying don't ever be influenced by anyone from the outside. I'm saying if there are people outside that are not doing what they're supposed to, do not allow those people to change what you are doing. Because Joshua is saying, you know what, every single other family in Israel, they can go out, they can serve idols. I don't want them to. I've warned them not to. I've told them that they are going to hurt themselves if they continue to do this. But you know what? Even if all of that happens, even if every single other family is unfaithful to God, my house will be. And if that means that God winds up destroying Israel, that they wind up being taken over by someone, which, by the way, eventually did happen because of idolatry. Even if the whole world comes crashing down around me and everybody else is living in sin and debauchery, my house follows God. End of discussion. It's actually the same mentality that Noah had. I mean, literally the entire rest of the world was unrighteous, but his 3 sons were saved. His wife was saved. He made sure that his house was in order, and Joshua was determined to do the same. And before I leave you for this week, this is the thought that I really want to stick in your head. Because all those things are really important. All those 3 lessons that we just talked about, super important. I want you to take those home and chew on them for a little bit. But at the end of them, I want you to remember this. He didn't say choose. He said choose today. Or as the King James puts it, and I like this because I cut my teeth on the King James and I remember it better. Choose ye this day. In other words, this is not a decision that you get to make later. This is not something to kick the can down the road and decide maybe at some point when you get around to it. Choose now. Right now. And live with the consequences of your decision. You know, there's a great C.S. Lewis quote where he talks about there's so many men that want to be, that will pray for righteousness. But what they really mean is, God, make me righteous tomorrow. God, help me eradicate the sin from my life tomorrow. Let me, sow my wild oats and do what I want to, and then at some point I'll get around to following you, and then they wind up dying and they've never done it. You see, God is too important and deserves better then, well, I'm going to do what I want for a little while and then I'll get around to following God. Now, that's not how this works. You choose today what you're going to do. You choose today whether you are going to follow God or follow the world. Joshua had his mind made up. And I hope you'll make your mind up too, and I hope that you'll come to the same decision that Joshua did. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ.